understand where we are today so that we're in a better position to explain how we got to where we are today. And in explaining how we got to where we are today, in order to understand the consequences. All of that is stuff that we've already covered yesterday in terms of the consequences as opportunity costs. That is what I call the stakes in the relationship. But that in turn, in order to give one a sense of what can and should be done, those are different, very different topics, but they are related. And that's what we will focus on today and tomorrow. Doing that at its core is something that doesn't get done in government. So in many ways, it's a heuristic exercise rather than a practical, if you like, policy-informed exercise. That is the task of integrating your response to what is the current imperative agenda, the immediate, what I would call the short-term agenda with all the issues that we're aware of and that governments are focused on both sides, Ukraine, Syria, INF, and the like, with a longer-term notion of what you would want to do, where you'd want the relationship to be in the longer run. And then I would argue in that analytical process that you also identify some intermediate objectives that take you along that path and are, in effect, benchmarks, but also important points of achievement in doing that kind of thing. No government does that, and no government, neither of these governments will do that in the near term. But I think it helps one think through the broader analytical problem to go through the exercise. Were this actually to happen, were policy planning staffs in Washington or in Moscow, and both governments have policy planning staffs in their foreign ministries, I would think that you start with that, what I call strategic vision, or what I've put before you today. Where do you want the relationship to be 8 years from now, or pick whatever period of time seems to you practical? Not 25 years from now, probably not 4 years from now. That'll be too cluttered with the politics of the relationship, elections and the like, but say 8 years from now. And then work back from that to, well, what set of objectives would you like to have achieved midway, say 4 years down the road, that take you down that path? And then in turn, how should that inform or affect the way in which you think about what you do to deal with the problems you've got to deal with now, which are Ukraine, Russian interference in US elections, Syria, and the like? If you actually did that, if governments actually did that, I think the process would be reversed in implementation. Having thought your way through that problem, what you would do initially would be to attack the problems that you have to attack and hope that you can go about dealing with them in a way that doesn't screw up the entire exercise, getting you to your long-term objective. Now, I repeat, that's a heuristic exercise. It doesn't happen, and it isn't going to happen. But I think it'll make you more thoughtful analysts of where we are if you do that. The first part of that, then, of that exercise is what I call strategic vision, developing that notion of where you want it to be 8 years from now. And I've asked you to do that. I'm going to ask Harrison to start us with 5 minutes of the way he's thought about it, and then we'll go through on the Russian side. Let's start on the Russian side. And then there will be others to follow. So I'll ask others of you to duplicate that. We'll talk a little bit about the Russian side, then we'll turn to the US side. And to set the scene for you, it would be essentially the following. So Harrison, you end up in Moscow. Let's assume you take the subway, the metro, over to Smolenskaya Ploshchad, where the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is. And you'd get off at one of the two Smolenskaya stations. You'd walk down the street, probably next to that supermarket, Sid Moy Continent, which is on the corner next to the wedding cake architecture of Mead. You'd go into Mead, and you'd be met by somebody after you clear security who comes from Foreign Minister Lavrov's office, and he would take you up to the 7th floor. You walk down a long corridor that has carpeting, probably the leftover carpeting from the Soviet period that you're familiar with. And as you walk down that corridor, there would be a lot of pictures on the wall. They'd be former foreign ministers of both current Russia, the Soviet Union, Imperial Russia, at least back to Catherine. And they take you into a room that would be the size of a small living room, probably, say, 25 by 25 feet. There'd be a bank of windows at one side of it, and there'd be a table that's probably about 10 feet long, rather ornate, with maybe 7 or 8 chairs on each side, rather ornate. And you'd sit down in the middle chair on the one side. You'd be facing the windows along the panel of that room that has pictures from Russian history, often wars, all the way back to 18th century. And Lavrov would come in, he'd sit opposite you on the other side, and there'd be a young aide with him who would be there to take notes. And you would start by saying, I understand that with Tillerson you've said, in effect, that this relationship is in a very deep hole. We need to stop digging, and if possible, we need to begin to think about ways in which we can turn it around. If that's your concern at the moment, if you're going to do this well, you also need to think about where you want this relationship to be 8 years from now. Let me again repeat what I said toward the end of the last session, be a little bit more elaborate. When I listened to both sides, and this is thoughtful, it's clear that you people have begun thinking seriously about this fundamental question of where we go from here. And I said apples and oranges. There are really 3 things that were involved in the reports. That is 3 ways of focusing the issue in the reports that Alex and Harrison gave. A substantial part of the reports, particularly the one from the American side, thinking about the Russia that you wanted 8 years from now, that focused on key issues, that is, what the topic should be. That's somewhat different from the core of strategic vision. The second thing that both reports did is what should we do, that is the strategy side, whether it was restarting the NATO-Russia Council, or whether it was moving away from sanctions or whatever. The third thing, though, that really should be at the heart of it is what kind of a Russia do you want 8 years from now as a foreign policy actor? What kind of a foreign policy actor do you want to be dealing with 8 years from now? And therefore, if you take some of the points that you were making, say Harrison's report on longer run, and one of the items that he raised that the group raised was nuclear arms control and dealing with reality that in fact the process since 2010 has largely been interrupted, and you would want that process to be launched again. In that context, I think when you get to a strategic vision, what the Russian side would want on that topic is a U.S. negotiating partner that had accepted at least some part of the basis by which Russia wants to continue negotiating strategic arms control. That's been part of the problem. The Russians have wanted a kind of omnibus agenda. Everything that includes multilateralizing strategic nuclear arms control to incorporating conventional strategic to, above all else, incorporating missile defense. The American position has been basically, let's continue doing what we're doing, which is reducing warheads from the goal of 1,550 down to maybe 1,000. That's where the Obama administration was, and the delivery vehicles for them. Let's not clutter it with all of these other things yet along the way. Well, as a Russian, what you'd want, maybe you can't get all of it, but you'd want a resumption of negotiations that respect or that acknowledge parts of the agenda. Or when you speak about United Nations and reform, in terms broadly of global governments, if you're a Russian, what do you want? You want, it's a bit of what the Chinese want too, and that is you want more voice in institutions like the IMF or the World Bank, which have been essentially dominated in their voting procedure and their operation to serve the major countries in the OECD or even EU and the United States. So you would want reform that increases Russia's voice. In the UN, You've talked about the way in which you summarized it was reshuffling and enlarging the Security Council. There, the Russians are not at a disadvantage. They're one of the five with a veto, and the real question is, do you include in India, for example, in this process? That's a little more complicated question, because the Chinese have resisted that, and you're working with the Chinese. Are you going to go up against the Chinese and say, no, for our own reasons, we think India should be in, or in whatever other way? But in any case, I'm not quite sure what kind of a U.S. foreign policy actor you want 8 years from now on the UN issue. Presumably what you'd want is a United Nations, a U.S. that feels more bound by the UN Charter and the UN process before, for example, it goes off on interventions with coalitions of the willing or outside the framework of the United Nations, such as what happened in Kosovo in 1999. That was outside a UN authorized framework, and the Russians, Chinese, and others have said that. But then the real question is, the Russians have done a whole series of things too that are without, including Ukraine, that are not within it. It's a fair challenge to the notion of this entire exercise. That is why, if you're going to have a different U.S.-Russia relationship, do you have to go through the exercise I'm describing, conceptualize the depth of the deteriorated relationship, explain how we got here, and then in thinking about how you move forward, struggling with how you integrate short-term imperatives with a long-term vision and develop a long-term vision. Why can't one simply operate the way in which this thing works in the Russian-Iranian case? My response to that would be, I think the situation is different when a relationship is as deteriorated as this relationship is in order to dig yourself out. I think you need to do things that are more extraordinary, at least from an analytical point of view, even if that doesn't become the actual political process. And secondly, I also believe that the reason why we had what I call the sine graph, where the amplitude of the positive and the negative shifts, negative increasingly and the axis is downward, is largely because there wasn't strategic vision during that period of time. I'll tell you a story. I did a foreign affairs piece I think 2 years into the Obama administration, in which I praised them for what they were doing in terms of setting the benchmarks, the 4 things they wanted accomplished: renewal of the New START agreement, overline supply route to the Afghan war, northern distribution thing, Russian buy-in into the International Nuclear Security Conference, increasing the sanctions on Iran, 1929, and so on. But my argument was that's not a strategic vision. I said it doesn't have to be fancy, it doesn't have to be an elaborate political science IR concept. It could be as simple as, where do you want this relationship to be? And I didn't say 8 years, but it was a phrase like that. I had, during that period of time, been spending a fair amount of time with people in the administration, including McFaul when he was at the NSC. He was really the person who worked most closely with Obama in designing the reset and setting all of these things up. And I got a very angry note from Michael after that article appeared. He said, "I'm just coming back from Central Asia. It's been a couple of weeks. I hadn't had a chance to read the article. I've read it." And he said, "God damn it, Legvold." He said, "I spent all this time with you, and you don't think we have a strategic vision? The Obama administration?" I said, and then we went back and forth with email. I said, "No, I mean, your concept of strategic vision isn't strategic vision." And they never developed it. What they developed were benchmarks. That's very different from a strategic vision. And the Russians never even tried. And I think that helps to account for the sine graph. Now, that doesn't have to be in all instances. I take your point. And maybe the way you want to think about what I've forced you to do this week is not the way you want to think about this problem. Maybe you want to think about it your way, and then the challenge is, how do you get back to a point where that's what's happening in the U.S.-Russia relationship? How do you get to what the Russian-Iranian relationship looks like? All right, what a number of you have said in terms of compatibility and not on strategic vision is appropriate. Essentially what you're saying in response to what was the assignment in terms of strategic vision, where do you want this relationship to be 8 years from now in terms of what agenda would work 8 years from now. And you've identified what could be on that agenda that would be working and where we would be cooperating. The alternative is, what kind of an actor do you want to be dealing with 8 years from now? And that's the way what I'm about to say to you is designed. You can agree, you can disagree. You'll see some parts of it echo what you've already been thinking, what you've already said. I start on the Russian side. And what I think they might want to achieve 8 years from now in terms of U.S. as a foreign policy actor: a United States that supports Russia's efforts to reform and to modernize its economy, not least by facilitating direct foreign investment, and for that matter, assisting in creating investment opportunities for Russia globally, whether it's Gulf of Mexico or elsewhere. Secondly, a United States 8 years from now that works with Russia not merely in developing oil and gas industry, but also in making this sector a critical base for diffusing higher technology within the economy. There are those who would argue, a number of them in the oil and gas industry, senior officials, for example, within Statoil, that would argue the notion of duplicating Silicon Valley and doing IT the way the United States has done in this next stage of economic development, it doesn't make sense in Russia. Russia's advanced industry is oil and gas, and if it can be technologically advanced and you can then diffuse that technology to other parts of the economy, that makes sense. So in this case, a U.S. that's facilitating that, if that is correct. Third, a United States that values a multi-vectored Russian foreign policy, that is, where Russia has constructive relations in all directions with the BRICS, but also with the OECD countries. And the United States welcomes that kind of diffusion of Russian attention and engagement. A United States that respects Russia's legitimate security and economic interests within the post-Soviet space. Well, there the problem is definition, what's legitimate, how the Russians define it and otherwise. But in any case, something that a reasonable person would identify as legitimate Russian interests, security and economic, in the countries of the former Soviet Union. And that a U.S. that encourages Russia's neighbors to pursue a constructive policy with Russia rather than a policy that balances against Russia. That the United States is in favor of that. That these nations around Russia are interested in a constructive relationship, not simply in balancing against Russia. A United States that resorts less, 8 years from now, that resorts less to the unilateral use of force and coalitions of the willing, and instead is more interested in constructing what might be called communities of the responsible, all that should care about Syria, or all that should care about an Afghan crisis, and not simply U.S. unilateralism or coalitions of the willing. A United States that welcomes Russia's participation in the international economic enterprise that it undertakes. The U.S. has, on this administration, backed away from TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and not quite clear where TTIP will go, that is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. But we never at the time thought about including Russia in those exercises, but a Russia that, were they underway or were they to be revived, a Russia would want a United States that was willing to entertain the possibility that the Russians would be part of that. A United States that finally, in the long run, that is the 8 years, seeks Russia's cooperation in dealing with critical regional conflicts by striving to reconcile different assessments and approaches, including the point, I think it was in Harrison's report, of reconciling discrepancies in tactical approaches to the problem, figuring out ways by which those can be brought together. If you go the other direction, the United States, what kind of a Russia would it want to be dealing with 8 years from now? A situation where Russia assigns a high priority a high priority to cooperation with the United States, a priority at least as high as cooperation with any other country, including China. That it assigns a priority to cooperation with the United States that's not inferior to cooperation with any other major power, Europeans, China, and otherwise. Secondly, a Russia that works to attenuate tensions between the United States and third countries rather than exploit and intensify tensions between the United States and third powers. Third, you would want a Russia that has created a domestic environment that's conducive to closer U.S.-Russia economic relations and to what I had said on the other side, to investment in Russian modernization moving forward. But a Russia that has created an environment that's conducive to it in terms of reform and predictability and so on. Fourth, the United States would want a Russia that seeks to deal with security challenges in the post-Soviet space, that is, in the former Soviet Union, by employing a strategy of reassurance with neighbors rather than a strategy of coercion. In IR theory, there's very little work that's been done on strategies of reassurance. That is, essentially what you're attempting to do is facilitate your neighbor or your interlocutor's sense of security rather than coercion within that relationship. In short, that national security, the way in which you go about it in dealing with the Ukraine or dealing with the Baltic states, is to stress mutual security rather than national security. You'd want a Russia that thinks in those terms with its neighborhood. It has not. It has not thought in terms of reassurance. It has thought in terms of coercion in dealing with its own security problems. And you'd want a Russia that cooperates with the United States in addressing regional crises, Middle East, Syria within the Middle East, that focuses on common ends rather than tactical differences of getting there. That was very important making progress on the Iran deal. We had a common end, we had differences of how you get there. And we got it because we focused on the common end, as opposed to the differences over how you get there. For both countries, you would want 8 years from now a relationship in which each engages in extensive cooperation, extensive cooperative effort to deal with the new global threats of catastrophic terrorism, of health pandemics, of the nexus between climate change and impending resource conflicts and the connection to energy, access to energy, and so on. So an approach to the international energy economy that is cooperative rather than competitive in that context in terms of global challenges. In terms of the two, you'd want 8 years from now a situation that produces joint leadership in trying to move towards some progress in dealing with this complex multipolar nuclear world, whatever that's going to look like. It's not going to, if there is progress in this direction under U.S.-Russian leadership, it's not going to be the way in which we made progress during the Cold War, where the two countries sat down and negotiated over years different agreements, a SALT agreement, a START agreement, a new START agreement. That's not what's going to happen. It'll be a mix of all kinds of things that are sort of the way in which you build a regime. Some of it will be bilateral, some of it will be by executive agreement, some of it will be by patterns of behavior, some of it will be multilateral, some of it will be trilateral. Maybe in dealing with weaponization of space, it will be essentially acceptable codes of conduct among the United States, Russia, and China. But when it comes to dealing with other dimensions, it's probably going to require something very different along the way. But you would want U.S.-Russia leadership wrestling with that problem of how you pull this jigsaw together in this context. 8 years from now, that they were beginning to wrestle with the problem. Might not have made a lot of progress, but they were at least working the problem. And third, you'd want one where you'd want a situation 8 years from now that strengthens, and this you've said, you stressed it, beginning with Hannah and others emphasized it, that strengthens traditional U.S.-Russia cooperation on non-proliferation. That cooperation has been there historically. It actually has weakened in the context of the new Cold War, and that was evident at the last review conference, and why we didn't get a final statement. It had primarily to do with a non-nuclear regime for the Middle East, but for the first time, the two countries were obstacles in getting that final statement at the last review conference. So in some ways, that historical cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union, the United States and Russia on non-proliferation has moved the other direction. You'd want it to be reversed and strengthened again. And finally, you would want a relationship 8 years from now where both sides are striving to transcend or minimize the effects of the values conflict in international politics. My view is that when it comes to the so-called values conflict between the United States and Russia, or Russia and the West, they exist at two levels. We tend to focus principally on the domestic level, that Russia's political behavior at home and their objection to our behavior and Europe's on same-sex marriage or a host of these other things, that's the value clash, sort of the clash of civilization, if you will, in a modern form. But we have a values clash in international politics. We have a clash over the rules of Westphalia, that is sovereignty trumping everything, versus humanitarian interventionism. We have a clash over the use of force outside the rules of the United Nations, the unilateralism and the like. And what you'd want 8 years from now is that we were more on the same page in terms of values or norms in international politics than we are right now. And you certainly would want, from the US side going back to the other, a Russia that has perhaps not articulated or formally acknowledged that it did violate an important norm in the case of Crimea, and it will not violate that norm in the future, and it doesn't want other countries to violate that norm in the future. Now, at the next level, if you were to think about, say, 5 years out or 4 years out at the intermediate level, what kind of interlocutor do you want on the other side? On the Russian side, and here you'll see the similarity in what you've said, you would want a United States, a relationship with the United States that has freed Russia from the economic sanctions that are imposed by the United States, by the EU, by Australia, by Canada, by Japan. Secondly, you would want a revival of the U.S.-Russia Presidential Commission and the working groups under it. Again, I'm repeating what you people have already said should be done. That would be an intermediate objective. That's not 8 years from now. That is as soon as you can get to it in the next 4 or 5 years. You would want in the next 3 or 4 years, a United States that is more sensitive to Russian concerns when it comes to U.S. intervention in regional conflicts, that it doesn't just go off on its own, but that it listens to Russian concerns about intervening in Libya or intervening in, well, in the case of Syria, it's a more complex story. And third and finally, you'd want a United States 3 or 4 years from now that in framing issues, that the way it framed issues and acted in a way that while engaging Russian society, that is acting to influence Russian society with NGOs and the other, did so in a way that didn't appear to be designed for regime change. That's tricky, but that you were conscious of the way in which you were sponsoring involvement in the other society that it didn't look obviously like. There would be conflicts of perception between the two sides, but didn't look like regime change. For the United States at the intermediate stage, in thinking about Russia and the relationship, there would be, and again, you've said this, responding to some of what I've said about the importance of Russian influence attempts in the election, Russia that has accepted the fact and acted on the red lines of what is permissible in terms of involving yourself in the domestic politics of the other side, particularly elections. That in the end will have to be reciprocal. There'll have to be a way we can talk about it that also acknowledges Russia's concerns in this area, but you'd want a Russia that has faced up to that fact, and we have begun agreeing on and acting on the red lines. You would want a Russia that is less mistrustful, less skeptical of, and less opposed to constructive U.S. efforts, aspects of U.S. policy in the post-Soviet space, rather than treating virtually every initiative on the part of the United States in Central Asia, the Caucasus, or in the West that gave more of the benefit of the doubt to what the United States is doing in that area, rather than starting from a suspicious point of view. You would want to see a Russia that does not regard U.S. relations with, that regards Russia's relations with the BRICS or within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as essentially competitive and partially a counter to U.S. foreign policy. You'd want those organizations to be seen as potentially a complement to other institutions. You'd want Russia to be thinking about the way in which Shanghai Cooperation Organization can work with NATO in dealing with the narcotics trade, for example, or some of these other problems, rather than treating them as a potential counter to U.S. foreign policy. Finally, in this area, in terms of the United States with respect to Russia, you would want a Russian leadership that stresses more the underlying values that Russia does have in common with the West, as opposed to stressing the value of conflicts, which is what's happening now. The stress is on where the conflicts are, rather than where there can be overlap in these values. Finally, in terms of what might be common at this intermediate stage, you want one that halts the collapse of the very elaborate patchwork of arms control. We're in the process of dismantling whatever arms control we've built for the last 50 years. And you'd want a relationship where the two sides are working to halt that process, including the last two phases, an INF agreement under pressure, and the uncertain prospects of renewing New START, which is scheduled. You can have a 5-year renewal as of 2021, and there are pressures in the U.S. Congress at this point not to provide any funding that would allow us to extend New START past 2021. It's not clear what will happen to INF. We know what has happened to ABM. We know what has happened to CFE. We know what has happened to the Fissile Material International Security Conference. We know what has happened to Threat Initiative, Nunn-Lugar, and the like. We want to stop that process soon, in the next 2 or 3 years along the way. Third, we want, I would think, for 3-4 years out, steps that produce effective cooperation in countering the threat of catastrophic terrorism. We have not worked that problem hard, and we're working it less well these days. We need to renew that effort of cooperation. There are a variety of ways, areas, including cyber, which is what they did talk a little bit about in Hamburg. That's what the cyber security unit was supposed to focus on from the Russian side. I think it's unfortunate because it may have almost been a diversion from focusing that effort on election interference as opposed to an alternative topic. And finally, you would want progress soon, not 8 years from now, but soon, in working out a code of conduct in cyber in a way that also includes the Chinese in the near term. Now, the question is feasibility, question of how you get to it. You're back to Hannah's original point about the pessimism that guided your thinking. As I say, the pessimism that dominates everyone's thinking on both sides at this point. what the steps would be to move in that direction. But that's what we'll talk about in greater detail, or I will talk about, share thoughts tomorrow.